We start by creating a knowledge base, a KB, that corresponds to the application's project. Here we specify its name, and here the development environment with which we will prototype the application. We choose C#. Upon pressing Create, the import of all objects necessary to initialize the knowledge base will commence. Among other things, all the GeneXus objects that will implement our application will appear in the View folder. We will start by implementing the panel to show the materials of the ERP. For each material, we will want to show the identifier and the description. So we will create a structured data type that we will name Materials. This will be a collection of items that we will call Material, each of which will comprise a material ID of the character 18 type and a material description of the character 40 type. Now let's create the panel to show the materials. We filter by Objects for Smart Devices and then Panel for Smart Devices. We will call it WW, Work With, SD, Smart Devices, Materials. We can see that there are several tabs to implement the various parts of the object. We'll start by defining a variable of the structured data type that we just defined. To do this, we drag the data type and define a variable with the same name. We will want to show its content on the panel screen. So what we do is insert the variable as a control. We could choose to show only descriptions, but instead we will show everything. We can see that GeneXus automatically created grid controls with two controls of the variable type, one for the material identifier and the other for the description. Since it's based on a structured variable, GeneXus will load this automatically in runtime with the contents of the variable at that point. We can add controls inside the grid, such as, for example, a table to align controls with one another. We place the controls inside, and for the material identifier, we enable the label located on the left. And we change its caption to ID. We can add images imported to the knowledge base, such as this one, in order to allow the user to tap on it and update the data of the material selected. We can do the same to delete. Here we've already modified the properties of the rows and columns, and those of the controls, so that they're aligned and occupy the spaces we want, and so on. But we won't go into those details. Note that the Style tab briefly shows what the layout will look in runtime. All we need to do now is load the materials variable. The programming of panels is done through events. We must load the variable prior to executing the grid load on screen. That moment is the event of the refresh system, which takes place before the fixed part of the panel is loaded. Immediately following this event, the grid will be loaded on screen according to the variable's content. Here, we must load the variable. To do this, we call a GeneXus procedure that we will call and we'll pass the materials variable. Variables are written with prefix of the ampersand character so that it's returned loaded. This procedure will implement the RFC to the corresponding BAPI. We must create it. This type of object is an exception in GeneXus because its logic is almost completely procedural, as opposed to what happens with the overall trend in GeneXus that tends to be declarative. Let's first indicate that, resulting from the execution, it will return a list of materials. To this purpose, we specify in the Rules section the parm rule that declares the input and output parameters. In principle, we know that there will be an output parameter that will be a variable that we will also call materials, so we add it as a variable. Since to name it, we use the same name as that of the data type, it assumes it by default. Now in the source, we must load it through the BAPI. To do this, we must import that BAPI. But how do we do that? We'll see this in the next video.